member of Hackney SWP, and I'm going to be your chair for this meeting. I'd like to welcome everyone. This meeting is on Islamic Fundamentalism, and it's running a course on the Middle East. The speaker is Talat Ahmed. She's a lecturer at Hackney College in Sociology, and she's also a member of Hackney SWP as well. She's going to speak for about 35 minutes, and after which there's going to be plenty of time for people to come up and have discussions and debates and just ask questions if they want anything clarified. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to Talat. Thanks a lot.
Okay, when we think about the world that we live in, one of the most startling phenomena, I suppose, has been the growth of what has been commonly labelled Islamic fundamentalism, the growth of a whole set of ideas across the world which are defined as representing Islamicism, fundamentalism, Muslim groupings, etc. Whether this is in the form of the Taliban forces in Afghanistan, whether it's Muslim clerics in Iran, whether it's Islamic militants in Algeria or in Egypt, whether it's the influence of organizations like Hezbollah amongst the Palestinians across the Lebanon and the Middle East, or indeed even in our own country, in Britain, the influence of all sorts of Islamic ideas amongst young Asian people in areas such as the East End of London or in Burnley or Oldham at the moment. These are a set of ideas which are defined as being Islamic fundamentalist, and really the way that it's seen in the world is that these ideas are growing, these movements are growing, and really what should the response of the modern world be? And really the response of the modern world in our societies has been one of complete and utter horror. So, for example, there's an Italian right-wing politician who has called for an end to Muslim immigration into Europe because, as far as he's concerned, these people, these ideas, their religion represents something which is completely alien to democratic principles in Europe, and therefore we shouldn't really be allowing these people in our midst, and what have you. And what is interesting is that really for our rulers right across the world, Islamic fundamentalism is seen as the worst catastrophe to have hit the modern world. It is regarded as evil incarnate. It is seen as threatening freedom, democracy and civilization as we know it. And therefore it's important for democratic peoples all over the world to guard against this great backward evil. And it's interesting because ever since the demise of the Soviet Union, the demise of communism as it was seen, which represented the main threat to the West, really since the demise of that, Islamic fundamentalism has come to be seen as public enemy number one. And in 1994, the then head of NATO in Europe actually said that, make no mistake about this, Islamic fundamentalism is the biggest threat to Western civilization. So this is really how we see it. And it's interesting because in Britain today, particularly, the word Islamophobia has become part of common currency, and really that word, I would argue, really does typify Western perceptions of Islam, particularly since the Iranian Revolution in 1979. And it's the kind of stuff that we get all the time from our governments. It's put out by people who, interestingly, support one of the most repressive regimes in the world, and that is the regime of Saudi Arabia, which also, incidentally, happens to be Islamic, but I will come on to that later. However, these sorts of ideas, I think, are not just confined to our rulers. Although I think it's becoming more evident that this whole idea of Islamophobia and fear of Islam and Muslims, many people, even in the liberal establishment, have come to recognize that there are dangers with issues of how this feeds into racism. Nevertheless, on certain issues, particularly the issue of women, many feminists in the West hold the view that Islam represents the single greatest threat to women's liberation, and they cite examples of the Taliban in Afghanistan as evidence for this. And really the argument is that these groups, the ideas that they perpetuate, really want to turn the clock back, They want to take us back to the Dark Ages. They represent complete intolerance, complete barbarity and what have you, and that really we should have nothing whatsoever to do with them. We should condemn them out of hand. And really this this view sees Islam as just one force. They don't recognise that there are any differences. It just sees it as one monolithic movement that people who believe in democracy should completely reject. I want to start from the position of arguing that really I don't think that should be our starting point. I don't believe that Islamist ideas represent some kind of irrational force that can't be explained by rational argument. Because I think the question that we have to ask is, why do Islamist ideas grow in the first place? Where is it that they come from? And when you ask that question, then the answer really lies in the world that we live in. Because the world that we live in is a world that is dominated by international capitalism. As I said, over the last decade, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, we were promised a new world order of peace and prosperity for all peoples throughout the world. And really, instead, throughout the 1990s and also into the beginning of the 21st century, what we have witnessed is really a period of world horror on an unprecedented scale. When you think about countries such as Algeria, throughout the 1990s, that country was racked by a bloody, murderous civil war which claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. When you think today what's happening in the Middle East amongst the Palestinians, the brutality that is meted out against them by one of the biggest military powers in the region, Israel, and what does the West do? The West just either stands by idly, or at worst, it actually condemns Palestinian teenagers for throwing stones and what have you. You think about the horrors across Kosovo, the continuing instability in the Balkans that we've witnessed throughout the 1990s. You think about at the start of the 1990s when the West declared a bloody war against Iraq, and even though that war has been over, the continuing sanctions imposed against that country and the suffering that causes, and the bombings that go on. When you think about all of these sorts of things, this is the kind of world that we have had since the end of the Cold War. So rather than having peace and prosperity for everyone, it's been a world completely racked by war, by devastation, and by suffering. And really, when we think about it, as capitalism has spread to every corner of the world, in that process, it has ripped apart people's lives and completely transformed them. And it's interesting because where Islamic ideas have actually grown has been in societies which have been completely traumatized by the experience of capitalism. Firstly, of course, because many of these societies are in the so-called underdeveloped world, they were traumatized by colonial exploitation, but then also since then they have been traumatized by internal conflicts which arise from the growing of the capitalist classes in those countries, but also the problems that come with the formation of independent states as well. And we have really what Leon Trotsky described at the beginning of the 20th century as combined and uneven development. And what he meant by that was that although capitalism was stretching its tentacles to every arena of the world, bringing more and more nations under the influence of capitalist relations, nevertheless within that you would still have fantastic unevenness between different countries. And that's exactly what we see. So although externally colonialism and colonial forces have completely retreated from those areas, in reality, imperialist powers still play a major role, particularly the United States, which uses its military power right across the Middle East to influence the production of the most important commodity in that region, which of course is oil. But also, of course, there are the internal problems of those societies too. Because as those societies have emerged as independent nation states and what have you, you have a situation where the state encourages large-scale modern industry, but at the same time, you still have the existence of traditional industry, and this still exists. This is based very much in small workshops, in market areas and what have you, where many people work. And also, since getting independence in those states, many of those countries have also witnessed a large agrarian reform that has taken place. And on the one hand, what that has resulted in is making some peasants very, very rich indeed, and they've become full-fledged capitalist farmers. But for the vast majority of peasants that used to live on that land, the result has really been complete dislocation and being dispossessed of their land. And these sorts of people, because they cannot make a living from the land anymore, they exist by doing all kinds of casual work in the workshops, in the markets, in the sprawling slums outside of the major cities. The impact of capitalism really across these countries has been to pull millions and millions of former peasants into the urbanized centres. And of course, in pulling these millions of peasants into the heartlands of the cities, they are promised that they will have a better life. They are promised that they will have work and what have you. This, of course, has proved to be completely illusory, because many of them find no work at all. So, for example, in Algeria, throughout the 1990s, over 8 million peasants were drawn into the cities from the former villages because there was no longer a living to be made in the villages. But out of those 8 million, only 2 million have been lucky enough to find work. For the rest, their life has been one of complete misery, of no hope, of total dislocation from society. In this kind of situation, these people have been, you have to remember, they've been ripped apart from the villages where they came from, drawn into these great big huge urban sprawls where they don't know anyone, etc. The only place of familiarity that they find in these societies is the mosque. And that is the only place that seems to offer some kind of certainty in a world which is completely fragmented to them. But at the same time, as they're drawn into these cities, as they can't find work, as their life is completely full of impoverishment, what they also see is that there is a certain section of their society, particularly the urban rich, who lead lives of unimagined luxury, whilst the remainder of them exist as casual labourers or unemployed and therefore remain impoverished. When we think about the horror of the world, as I mentioned before, you think about Palestinians, teenagers who were just mowed down mercilessly by the Israeli state. Throughout the 1990s, they were promised peace and they were promised land. Instead, throughout the 1990s, what we have witnessed is Israel continuing to expand and usurping the land that Arabs have lived on. And kids have been completely murdered by the Israeli state just for throwing stones, and as I said, the West stands by. You think about a country like Algeria. In the West, this society is portrayed as being some kind of bastion of democracy and what have you, and yet this is a regime that has fought a murderous civil war against various opposition groups, and inside those opposition groups there have been various Islamists that the state has been waging war against. In Britain, too, when you think about the horror of racism, which has all too graphically, unfortunately, been on display in areas such as Oldham, in Bradford, in Burnley, you have a situation where young Asian children, young Asian teenagers are told that really when it comes to racism, it's not the fault of fascists or Nazis or racists, but it's really your fault because you're Muslim and you just won't become British. That's your problem. You won't support Britain or England in the cricket team, and that is your problem. And it's all to do with your culture and your religion. When you think about people being brought up with that kind of horror, is it any wonder that people can end up looking to those very ideas to represent them? And really I want to argue that Islamist ideas represent an attempt to come to terms with the contradictions and the crisis in the world system. As such, they seem to offer a response to the horrors and the barbarity of the world that's gone completely mad. It also seems to offer a promise that those who profit from your misery in this life will be punished, either in this life or in the next life as they see it. This is the reason why organizations such as Hezbollah can grow across the Middle East. This is the reason why all kinds of sections of Islamic militants can gain a hearing across Algeria, across Egypt, and even amongst Muslim groupings in Britain too. And you think about countries like Algeria, in Egypt, there are huge numbers of student graduates who remain unemployed. They've been educated, they have degrees, but they have no employment at all. A small number of them may be lucky enough to rise through the state bureaucracy, but for the vast majority of them, they don't have the right connections, they don't speak French, they cannot get employment at all. So many young people who are graduates find that they can't get jobs in administration, they can't get jobs in areas to do with advanced technology or into higher levels of management. Many of these jobs in countries like Algeria end up going to those who are fluent in French. They don't tend to go to Arab speakers. This breeds resentment in a society where the majority of the population are Arab speakers. And it's interesting because it's been amongst this student group that throughout the 1990s, organizations like the Islamic Salvation Front, the militants of the GIA and the MIA really began to recruit heavily amongst that student layer. And I think that's a very, very important point. The reason I think it's important is because when we look at Islamist groups across the world, what we have to recognize is not only where they come from, but also the base of these particular groupings as well. Because the particular milieu and the base that these groupings have, I think, help to explain both why they can pose themselves as a serious alternative to capitalist problems and society's horrors, but it also points to the limitations of these organizations and movements. Now, some people mistakenly believe that various Islamist groups represent all the oppressed people across the world, that they represent all workers. This is not the case at all. The class base of Islamist groups is what Karl Marx referred to as the petty bourgeoisie. And what he meant by that is that it's that section of society that lies between the ruling class on the one hand and the mass of workers on the other hand. And in a period of acute crisis, it's the section of society that gets squeezed between these two great classes. It's usually made up of small traders, of white-collar staff, of doctors, teachers, some students, etc. But in addition to these kinds of groupings, there are also the urban poor, the vast army of people who are sporadically employed, particularly in many parts of the third world. They're sporadically employed as taxi drivers, as waiters, as tourist guides and what have you. These people also make up some of the base of Islamist groups across the world, and of course the vast mass of the urban poor who are unemployed. So, for example, in countries like Egypt, where the Muslim Brotherhood began to arise in the 1930s and the 1940s, their base was predominantly made up of civil servants and of students. But they also spread to include some of the urban poor, which included urban labourers and some peasants who had migrated into the cities but could not find any employment at all. There was a similar situation in Iran as well. The Islamists that were part of the movement to overthrow the Shah and what have you, their base was made up particularly in the markets, of small market traders, of students, and also of government employees whose parents had been part of the traditional petty bourgeoisie. In Afghanistan too, I'll return to this later, people have this idea that the Taliban are completely irrational, backward, and what have you. But it's interesting because the Taliban, throughout the 1990s, when they grew, where did they recruit? They recruited amongst the intelligentsia. They recruited amongst students. And what kind of students and intelligentsia did they recruit amongst? Scientific students. Students that were doing technology courses, engineers, etc. This is where their base and their cadre have come from. Now, what unites these people, although they are in different parts of the world, is their complete contempt for their own rulers and also for those who back them, the imperialist forces. In attacking all symbols of Western imperialism, Islamist groups will use the language of liberation from oppression. They damn all Western society for being corrupt, for being devoid of any kind of meaning, and what have you. But their severest criticism is not just directed at the West, it is also targeted very much at the so-called Islamic countries themselves, at the leaders of those countries, the leaders of countries like Saudi Arabia, of Pakistan, of Egypt, of Algeria. These leaders are condemned for being traitors to Islam. They're condemned for their corruption. They're condemned for corrupting Islam and Islamic principles. They're also cursed for the links that they have to the great imperial power, the great Satan, the United States, and also its loyal ally in the region, the Israeli state. When these groups look around their society, they see the excesses of their rulers. They lead completely decadent lifestyles. They quite rightly identify these rulers and blame them. They blame this elite for their misery and for their impoverishment. You have to remember, in these kinds of societies, many of these people, particularly if they've come from rural areas, have been brought up to respect their religion. And yet when they are drawn into the cities and the towns, what do they see? They see their leaders, who are meant to be Islamic, openly flouting religious convention in the form of dress code, alcohol consumption, gambling, you name it. They see them flaunting their wealth everywhere. And they are drawn to those forces that will condemn them. And sometimes those forces have been inside the mosques. Sometimes those forces have been various imams up and down various mosques and what have you. Now, Islamic groups, when you think about how they operate, it's interesting because they use a phrase which is called the ummah, meaning community. And Islamic groups call upon the Muslim community to break with existing society. I mean, again, when people use this word fundamentalism to imply that somehow, Islamic groups, because they're backward, because they just want to keep society either as it is or to take it backwards, this actually is not the case. Many of them turn around and say that the world we live in, the society we live in, is completely disgusting, it's totally corrupt, it's totally unequal, and what we have to do is break with it, and we have to fight against it. And this is what they do. They call upon Muslims to break with existing society. They call upon Muslims to make history by declaring war, as they see it, on un-Islamic leaders in their societies. And what they propose is a return to the original principles of Islam, without corruption, without poverty, a society in a world where there will be respect for the poor, protection for the poor, and for the needy. And the very sophisticated arguments of various Islamic fundamentalists are that just as you, as socialists, don't believe that there is a socialist society anywhere in the world, and therefore you say we have to wage war against capitalism to establish socialism, well, we too say there is no Islamic society anywhere in the world, which is why we have to wage war against all these societies in order to have a true Islamic society. And these various Islamic groups, they pose themselves as cleansers and purifiers of a system gone wrong. That is how they see themselves. And this is why it is wrong to simply see them as just harking back to the past, or that they just want to turn the clock back. In many of these situations, it isn't that they want to return to a society of Mecca in the 7th century AD or anything like that. Many of them actually realize that we live in a modern world. They're very sophisticated. They want to use the banking systems. They want to use modern technology, but they want to use it in an Islamic way as they see it, because other people have corrupted these things. However, we also have to recognize that although Islamic groups have this kind of base, their base and their milieu is petit bourgeois, so therefore they can use the language of liberation, they can use radical rhetoric, but also at the same time this can be combined with quite reactionary ideas as well. And therefore they can end up attacking anything which is secular and that they don't agree with. So, for example, as we know already, they can turn on women for being immodest as they see it, and they will go around insisting that women have to cover themselves up. In a country like Algeria, they can go around attacking minority groups. They've attacked Berbers, even though Berbers are Muslims. They've attacked the Berber community throughout the 1990s because Berbers happen to be French speakers and not Arab speakers. In countries like Egypt, various minorities have been attacked because they're Christian. So, for example, Copts have been attacked by various Islamic militants because they're seen as being part of the Western conspiracy to undermine Islam. People who are gay, people who display all kinds of so-called deviations from sexual practices, like adulterers, have also been attacked by Islamist groups. When you think about in Afghanistan recently, when they decided to go and blow up the Buddhist monuments inside Afghanistan, again targeting these monuments because they were seen as being un-Islamic and not part of their society at all. And really what I want to argue is that it's the double-edged nature of Islamic groups. That on the one hand, they can come out with all kinds of so-called progressive rhetoric, but also at the same time, they can combine this with very, very right-wing and reactionary ideas. So they can come out with so-called progressive rhetoric in terms of charity. So they talk about the Islamic principle of zakat, that the rich, it's their duty to look after the poor, to protect the poor, that everybody should contribute to the welfare of the poor. They also say that in Islam we want to treat women with respect. Look, in Islam we grant women the right to a divorce, women can have their own property, etc., etc. But these so-called progressive ideas can also be combined with very, very conservative ideas. So, for example, private property. Private property is completely enshrined within Islamic doctrine. The whole emphasis, as I said before, on the Ummah, the Islamic community, is very much this idea that all Muslims, irrespective of their background, irrespective of their class, interests, etc., should all unite against the evils of imperialism and what have you. And this combination of progressive ideas on the one hand and quite conservative and reactionary ideas on the other hand can give voice to both, on the one hand, the poor, the impoverished in the urban areas, the most exploited in society, but it can also give voice to that section of the middle class, the petty bourgeoisie, who hanker after a better life for themselves in existing society if only their infidel leaders did not exist. And this, I think, is very, very important because it is quite a contradictory phenomenon. They can appeal to different sets of interests, and it's important that we recognize that. Now, because of the social base of various Islamic groups, and because of their attacks upon women, because of their attacks upon minorities and what have you, it has led some people on the left to view Islamic groups as being fascist, really. And this, again, I believe, is mistaken, because I don't think that they can just be simply written off as being fascist. They may share a similar kind of social base to various fascist organizations, like the Shiv Sena in India, or like Le Pen's Front National in France, and what have you. But Islamic groups, by and large, have not been set up to be directed against a workers' movement, which is what fascist groups are all about, as they were in Germany and Italy. Islamic groups, more often than not, in the last 20, 30 years, have been involved in armed confrontation against the forces of the state. As I said, in Algeria and in Egypt, Islamist groups have been targeted for assassination by the forces of the state. They also take up anti-imperialist slogans, and not just slogans, they also actually take up anti-imperialist positions, anti-imperialist activities, and what have you. The kind of people that have been drawn to Islamic organizations and Islamic ideas, they want massive social change in society. They don't just want the preservation of existing society, because they have quite rightly identified existing society as being corrupt, as being unequal, as being exploitative and oppressive. They don't offer themselves to the ruling class as saviors of an acute crisis. In fact, quite the reverse. In many cases, as I said, they're actually involved in confronting the state openly, as they did in Iran in 1978-79, as they have been in Algeria, as they have been in Egypt, and what have you. And also the other thing that has to be remembered is that, many of these Islamic groups, whenever Islamic movements have arisen anywhere, particularly in the last 20, 30 years, the destabilizing effect that they have right across the region and what that represents for imperial powers cannot be underestimated at all. After the revolution in Iran in 1978-79, the United States had to completely rethink its foreign policy in that region, because its second most loyal ally after Israel, the Shah of Iran, had been deposed, and they couldn't just carry on with business as usual because the rippling effect of that revolution and what it represented. But as I said, what I think is true is that because of the social base and the milieu that Islamist group comes from, therefore the contradictory ideas that they represent, the contradictory interest groups that they can represent, means that they cannot be a credible or a consistent opponent against imperialism or against oppression. And this is because no matter how much various Islamist groups across the world can, if you like, give voice to the real bitterness, the real despair at the base of society, the frustrations of ordinary people in society. The double-edged nature of these organizations means that they are open to manipulation by our rulers. So again, although in the West the dominant idea is that the West is totally opposed to Islamist organizations and Islamic fundamentalism and what have you, in reality, our rulers will accommodate to these organizations, and not only accommodate, but they will do deals with these organizations when it suits them. And one of the most startling examples of this, I mean, there have been many, and I haven't got time to go through them all, but one of the most amazing examples of this is Afghanistan. For people in the West, the Taliban is viewed as the most irrational force on earth. It is seen as the most vile representation of Islam in the world. It is seen as being completely vile for its position on women, in terms of how women have been banned from education, how women are banned from employment, and it isn't just women. I mean, the Taliban have gone a stage further. They've banned things like kite flying, chess playing, music, cinema, any kind of leisure pursuit, anything which is enjoyable is banned under the Taliban. And of course, in our society in the West, this is posed very much as being the representative of Islamic ideas, and that this is total barbarity, and we have to guard against it. And I don't know if any of you saw a recent documentary 2 weeks ago where a journalist travelled back to Afghanistan in order to see what the Taliban are like. And one of the things I found so amazing about this documentary was that all the horrors of Afghani society were laid at the doorstep of the Taliban. Now, I am not for 1 minute suggesting that the Taliban are a wonderful, freedom-loving, democratic, socialist organization, because they are not. But the idea that somehow everything can be blamed on the Taliban for Afghanistan is completely wrong and irrational. I mean, there's no sense that the real tragedy of Afghanistan lay in the brutality of the Russian invasion in 1979, or with the civil war that followed in 1988. In that civil war, none of the various Islamic organizations that were fighting were capable of winning. The Taliban didn't emerge until 1966. It was in 1966 that they rolled onto the streets of Kabul. And the reason that they were welcomed by the mass of the population was because they were the only organization that were capable of ending the war and of bringing some kind of stability and order to that society. That's why they ended up having support. There are 3 million refugees that exist over the border in Pakistan who are Afghanis. Many of them ended up supporting the Taliban. Many of the recruits and the cadre for the Taliban came from those refugees who exist inside cities like Peshawar and what have you. And I think this is important because, again, when we look at the Taliban, the connivance of the Western leaders is absolutely breathtaking. The Taliban forces were built up by the Pakistani Secret Service inside the Pakistani borders. They provided the training, they provided the equipment, they provided the arms for them in the refugee camps in Pakistan. Where did the money come from for this training and for the armament? They were provided courtesy of Saudi Arabia. Why Saudi Arabia? Because the Taliban are Sunni. The Saudis are also Sunnis. The Saudis wanted to ensure that any kind of movement that emerged in Afghanistan, which, remember, borders Iran, was in their camp and not in the Iranian camp. And that is the reason why the Taliban come out with the most disgusting forms of anti-Shiite feelings and what have you, as the Saudis wanted them in their camp. And the other thing that we have to remember about why the Saudis and the Pakistanis were quite keen on backing them is, again, that single commodity that the Middle East has, oil. Right? The oil reserves in the Asian republics is a huge consideration for our rulers, particularly the United States. And, and it's absolutely phenomenal, because when we are told that what the United States' views are on the Taliban today, it's completely at odds with what they actually said when the Taliban were coming to power. At the time, in 1996, the State Department spokesperson said that the United States could see nothing objectionable about the version of Islamic law the Taliban had imposed in the areas that they controlled. The spokesman went on to say that the Taliban had to be acknowledged as an indigenous movement that had demonstrated staying power. In other words, the United States were quite happy to see the Taliban come there, and they were also quite happy to provide the money for the training and the equipment that they needed. Of course, this was before they discovered that Osman bin Laden was prepared to launch terrorist attacks against American interests. But again, when we think about a man like bin Laden, who, from all our understanding, is perhaps still in Afghanistan, well, where did he come from? Well, this is a rich Arab who basically decided to go and fight the holy war against the infidels, the Russians, in the 1980s. He went and joined the Mujahideen guerrillas, the same Mujahideen guerrillas that had been funded, organized and trained by the CIA and the United States state. So the idea that somehow our rulers have no interest in manipulating various Islamist groups is completely ridiculous. The same thing happened inside Egypt as well. You know, at the moment the state is at war against various Islamic organizations. President Sadat himself was assassinated in the 1980s by Islamic militants, yet he himself had encouraged various Islamist organizations. And the reason he'd encouraged them was because he wanted them to grow as opposed to the left. He repeatedly made all kinds of concessions to Islamists by introducing bits of the Sharia law on adultery and on drinking. And really, by 1978, the Muslim Brotherhood had increased its side absolutely beyond all belief. And similarly, the same thing has happened inside Algeria as well. So although FIS, the Islamic Salvation Front, launched a bloody civil war against the state after they cancelled the elections in 1990 that FIS had won, nevertheless, there are all kinds of factions inside the Islamic Salvation Front that want to accommodate with the state. Many of their leaders are in exile, and they have been quite openly willing to admit that they're prepared to do deals with the state, to talk to the state, and what have you. So it isn't simply a case that somehow it's Islamic fundamentalism here and the West here. I'm not trying to suggest for 1 minute that there is some kind of conspiracy to sponsor Islamist groups or anything like that. It isn't as clear-cut as that. It's a lot more complex, and it's very, very contradictory. But it also isn't a case that it's just about the West being against all kinds of Islamic fundamentalism. So to try and draw this to a close then, what should the response of socialists be to this? I said at the very beginning that Islamist ideas cannot be seen as one set of coherent ideas. They are completely contradictory. It's not one ideology at all. And I think the response has to be that it depends on the situation that we're in. Because when our rulers turn around and condemn Palestinians that shout slogans about Allah Akbar and Hezbollah, etc., when they're throwing stones at Israeli soldiers and what have you, when they condemn young Asians for fighting back against racism under the guise of the mosque and what have you, as being Muslim fanatics, then I don't think for 1 minute that we can support our rulers in that at all. I mean, when they talk about how barbaric Islam is, I always find it quite interesting. They go on about Islamic rules on beheadings and cutting off people's hands and how absolutely disgusting this kind of justice is. Well, it was interesting because the same documentary 2 weeks ago on Afghanistan, they actually interviewed a leading Taliban cleric and asked him to justify why it was that they have things like the cutting off of hands for theft and what have you. And he said, well, we have to do this, and we have to have people who've been victims watch this because it brings a sense of justice to the victims. Well, that is word for word what George Bush's line is on capital punishment inside the United States. So, we have to be very clear about the hypocrisy here. But having said that, that does not mean that we should condone or support Islamist ideas and groups unconditionally. Because when Islamist organizations attack Berbers for being French speakers, then we have to attack them. When they go around harassing women and insist that women have to cover themselves, we have to attack them. If women want to wear a veil, fine. If women don't want to wear a veil, they should not be forced to wear a veil. When they go around punishing gays, for being so-called deviant, we have to condemn them. When they go around blowing up Buddhist monuments, we also have to condemn them. I mean, it's an absolutely bloody stupid thing to do, and it shows the ignorance of the Taliban forces, because a society like Afghanistan has always been a society of a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual background and what have you. But having said that, in attacking these ideas, we should never, ever, ever line up with the forces of the state. We should never, ever, ever line up with our leaders, because the kinds of people who will end up looking to all kinds of Islamic groups are people who want to fight the system. They look at the world that we live in, they see it as a world completely gone mad, a world full of horrors, a world full of inequality and oppression, and they want to smash that system. They want to fight back against that system. The kinds of feelings that motivate these people are the same sorts of feelings that motivate me, that motivate every single one of you sitting in this room, which is a complete hatred of the world that we live in and a desire to create a new world. However, the problem with Islamist ideas are that they're really going to a cul-de-sac. They're ideas that are leading absolutely nowhere. And the class base and the milieu that these organizations are based in means that they will never be consistent opponents of imperialism and of oppression. And therefore, what we have to recognize is that we can't just condemn them out of hand. We have to look at why they arise, where they arise, and what the forces are behind them. But also, we have to engage in an argument with some of the people who are drawn to them. Because if they want to fight back against the system, we share that with them. But we have a duty to show them that fighting back under the guise of Islam is not really the way forward, because that just goes to a dead end. If you really want to fight the system, you have to have a set of ideas that have a clear understanding of where the problems of the system come from, what the enemy is. The enemy is capitalism, not infidels, it is capitalism. And therefore, only a set of ideas that identifies that as the enemy can offer any way forward in terms of trying to change the world.
Okay, comrades, this is the part of the meeting where we can have discussion. I'd like to encourage people to raise their hands and indicate if they want to speak. I'm going to be patient. I'm going to limit people to 3 minutes. If people want to talk, what I'll do is after 2 minutes I'll take the microphone like this and indicate that they've got a minute left. But I'd also like to encourage people, you don't have to speak for 3 minutes. If you've just got a question you want to ask, please don't feel shy, come up and ask the question. And I'll ask everyone to come up and speak into the mic, because the meeting is going to be taped. I can see several people. I'd like to ask the gentleman with the glasses there, come over with the glasses, followed by, followed by a woman had her hand up. Just where's she gone? Yeah, followed by the woman in the blue scarf.
Right, this is an incredibly important issue for the left, because the left has a terrible responsibility. It's actually the role of Stalinism and reformism in the Middle East which has left the field, the opposition to capitalism, open to the Islamists and led to the rise of the Islamists. You can look at the left's attitude to the Intifada in Algeria, you can look at the history of Stalinism in the Middle East, throughout the Middle East, in Egypt's another example. And that's why the Islamic politics could fill the gap. And then when we come to looking at the rise of Islamic politics, again, the left has failed terribly. In Algeria, they failed to support the Intifada, and when the army stepped in against the Islamists, they remained neutral or even supported the army. Now in Turkey, a lot of the left say, Turkey will not be Algeria. That's their big slogan. And then they proceed to do everything possible to repeat the mistakes of the left in the rest of the Middle East and try to ensure that Turkey will become Algeria. If you look at the rise of the Islamists in Turkey, it coincides with the election of Social Democrats into local councils and into government, and the disillusion with the betrayal of the Social Democrats led to the rise of the Islamists, got most of their votes from areas where the Social Democrats have been getting votes. And then when you came to the attitude to the rise of the Islamists, panic, lining up with the army, likening the Islamists to fascists, and then when we came to really a turning point in Turkish history, the military ultimatum of the 28th of February 1997, where the army stepped in and said, right, we're going to purge the Islamists, we're going to close down the Islamic parties, get the Islamists out of, they were then in the government. The left remain neutral, or even supported the army. And this was at a point where there was a massive movement in Turkey, a massive left-wing movement against corruption coming after the Susluk accident. And the whole of that movement was diverted by a trick where the army said, up to their necks in corruption, said, corruption, go for the Islamists. Go for the Islamists. And it worked. And it was a turning point. It actually led to a downturn in the movement in Turkey. So that's very, very important. You know, you have to know what side you're on when you've got people who are revolting and you've got military force, repression, trying to put them down. Now, they're not trying to go back to the Middle Ages, but they're not progressive either. And if you look again at the reaction to the IMF package in Turkey, the most militant demonstration was a demonstration of small shopkeepers, which had a predominantly Islamic political character. They really militant. We saw the damage they'd done to the police armoured cars the next demo we were on, and when they'd really made a mess of them. So I think we have to be clear. When people revolt against the system, we have to know which side we're on, and particularly when they're being repressed by the army, we have to know which side we're on. It doesn't matter what ideas they have in their heads, it doesn't matter the colour of the flags that they're waving in terms of our support, but we can't ignore those ideas. They are very important. The people on the big demonstration against the IMF package were hostile to women, were hostile. You know, they had reactionary ideas in their heads as well, and we have to know that they do not provide a way forward. When Erbakan, the leader of the Islamic Party, the second party, has now been banned on the orders of the army, held a wedding for his daughter. I mean, it was the most luxurious, incredible thing in one of the biggest hotels in Istanbul. The leadership of that party cannot offer a solution to the aspirations of the poor people who are supporting it, or even to the aspirations of the small businessmen who are supporting it. So we have to be clear about opposing the army, about opposing the state, and we have to be clear about the ideas of the people who are doing the fighting.
Okay, the next speaker will be followed by the comrade in the red T-shirt.
I want to clarify something about Islam. I was born in Cape Town, South Africa, and I do not agree with certain things that has been said today. Islam is a way of life. What happens in Asia, what happens in some Muslim countries is made by men, the laws. The Sharia is not like that. What is happening, killing women, is not in the Quran. And people should not blame Islam, and they shouldn't use it as a weapon. Thank you very much.
Okay, the next speaker will be followed by the woman at the back.
Today said that Islamic fundamentalism is not fascism at all. I completely disagree with that. If I don't know how many of you have ever visited Iran, Afghanistan, or countries like that. It's the most fascist states of all. The Christian people get oppressed, women get oppressed. Like it's almost completely similar to Nazi Germany. The Nazi Germany did also have progressive ideas, like everybody has a right to work and that sort of ideas. But they're completely fascist states who only agree people who completely follow the line of the state, and the Islamic are Islamic in their way, not in another way. It's like if you're Islamic, you're good. If you're Aryan, you're good. It's the same thing. That's the only thing the Islamic fundamentalists are thinking of. They're the one of the most fascist people I've ever seen and talked to. I know I don't know, I can't speak very good English, but the one thing I'm sure that Islamic fundamentalism is one of the most fascist political ever to be.
Okay, the next speaker will be followed by the man in the black T-shirt there.
Hello, comrades. I am from Turkey, and sorry for my bad English. in Turkey, almost the biggest opposition movement is the Islamic movement. Before the 18th, the Islamics, or the region, is the tool of the ruling class. At that time, the ruling class lived with the Islamic Party friendly. Even they support Islamics. But in the middle of the 19th, the religion became the banner of the oppressed people. In the 90s, the class movement and the left developed. The Social Democrat Party took the biggest votes in their history. Then they made the government with the Conservative Party. They sold to people who trust them. They accepted the IMF program. They created a big poverty. At that time, there is no big left alternative which pushed the people who trust social democrats to the left. Then the Islamic Party becomes the alternative and filled the gap. They grew quickly, but the ruling class, they didn't like this situation. They tried to smash the Islamic Party. In the 1998, a military intervention happened. The Islamic Party government fell down, and the Islamic Party was closed. In this period, the left took two different positions. One of these is some of the trade unions and the revolutionary left and the social democrats support military intervention, and the other position is the centralist party said that neither military nor the Islamic.
1 minute left. 1 minute left.
Okay. In the workplace, the left civil servants complained about the Islamic work made to the director. This position didn't stop the division of the working class, and they strengthened the intervention of the military to the democracy. The working class divided on the basis of secular and non-secular, and after that, the attacks become easier. The ruling class attacked the leader of the Kurdish struggle, Abdullah Öcalan. They attacked the revolutionaries in the prison. They attacked the trade unions. Before our coming, they again closed another Islamic party. At the front of our paper, we discussed it. They closed the biggest opposition party, Islamic Party. They accepted the law about trade unions.
Can you start summing up, please? Come on, can you start winding up, please?
Okay. They accepted the law about the trade union with the help of the police terror towards the resistance. They leave hundreds of young people to die in the prison. They force peasants and workers to accept IMF and Turkish ruling class program. They use violence against the Kurdish who want peace. They send the people to the prison because of their ideas. And we add that all of these are made by the same ruling class. All of the operations.
Can you start summing up, please, comrade? People.
I can't answer this.
Can you finish now, please?
Okay, all of the operations are against us, and now we want more democracy. We must fight for democracy, and we must defend the oppression people.
Okay, the next speaker will be followed by the comrade in the red anti-capitalist t-shirt.
See, I think we need to understand the contradictory nature of religion, that it is the heart of a heartless world, it is the sigh of the oppressed, it is the opium of the people, but at the same time, people influenced by this oppression and by religion actually can at certain times work with us, and we have to do so. And I also want to talk a little bit about experiences in Greater Manchester, where I live, over the last 12 months. In Bury, last November, a taxi driver, Tariq Javid, was murdered. The taxi drivers, almost all Pakistani, with whom we have worked over deportation campaigns in the past, went on strike for 3 days. The role of Islam in that dispute was shown by the leaders of the mosque, the middle class leadership, who argued for the end of that strike. We were unable to actually get the people with us who buy and read Socialist Worker to actually stop that happening. That's one very clear reactionary role played by Islam. On the other hand, if you look at what's happening in Oldham at the moment, amongst the young activists in Oldham, inside the Bangladeshi community, certainly the best one I've met, Nanu, is an Islamic fundamentalist. He's a born-again activist. We've had real arguments with him. When people say that fundamentalism is fascist, I think that's a horrendous formulation. We have to reject that out of hand. But we had to have an argument with Nanu. Nanu had a copy in his bookshop of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is one of the key texts used by the Nazis to justify the Holocaust. We had to say, look, Nanu, that goes, yeah? Nanu accepted that argument. He also said, we want the Anti-Nazi League down there at the meeting on Sunday in the local Bangladeshi community centre. We spoke to 500 Bangladeshis. We have to have an argument. Where are the women? You know, it's 500 men that you talk to. But the fact is that we are able to build an Anti-Nazi League working with Islamic fundamental activists. I think, who knows, how it will develop in terms of the individuals. I suspect we may have success with people like Nanu in actually winning him towards some of our ideas. What I'm absolutely clear about is that we are not going to defeat the Nazis in Oldham unless we're able to work with people like him. Thank you.
Okay, the next speaker will be followed by the comrade in the glasses.
Yeah, I want to talk about a strange situation that happened in Barcelona a few months ago, a demonstration of Palestine where we were attacked by Nazis. There were 10 Nazis in the middle of a group of 100, 200 Islamists, all chanting Hezbollah and death to the Jews. We tried to get the Nazis thrown off and they physically attacked us. Just to give the background to that, in the campaign for Palestine in Barcelona, which existed about 5 or 6 months ago, it was run by, I suppose, Arafat supporters, people more or less close to the Communist Party. They'd said nothing about the presence of Nazis in that campaign. It was only when we started found out about the meetings, started going and realised they were handing out Nazi leaflets in the campaign. They said, these can't be here, we can't have these people here. And after a big argument, they were thrown off. They came to the demonstration anyway, and in the middle they'd somehow taken in this group of Islamists and chanting all this stuff. We tried to get these 10 Nazis thrown off the demonstration. The leaders of the demonstration said, what can we do? And I thought, well, you could throw them off. And we failed physically. We weren't enough people to do it. I think the important thing is there were not 200 fascists on that demonstration, there were 10. And they were surrounded by, say, getting on for 200 people who are Islamists. And I think it's important to see they're not the same. That the Nazis are like the Nazis in Oldham. I mean, they look the same. And one of them physically hit me here, I'm sure it feels the same. One of our comrades at the back had scars for weeks afterwards. But the rest of the Islamists, they're immigrants with rubbish jobs, lots of them don't have documents, lots of them facing the racism of the police every day. And obviously, any other day, they'd be facing the racism of those Nazis. I think in that situation, the key for us was to try and divide them. Not to say, look, you're all the same, you're all Nazis, actually try and put a wedge between them. Unfortunately, we couldn't because most of them spoke Arabic, and they'd been told we're all Zionists, come to break up the demonstration. So we arrived and said we want to throw off the Nazis, say, look, they're the Zionists. And it was impossible to have a dialogue. It's something we have to work on. Now we have at least one Moroccan comrade who obviously speaks Arabic. That is a position you can start talking to people and try and break through that. If you say all these are Nazis, then you've lost it beforehand. I think you have to be clear about the differences.
Okay, the next speaker will be followed by the comrade in the red t-shirt at the front.
Well, I just wanted to answer to your interventions because I think that what you said is, your analysis is quite dangerous because I think that responding to the dominant analysis which says that the fundamentalist phenomenon is evil, saying that, it's not that evil, they are as revolted as us, which in a certain way I agree, but we just have to bring them with us and fight with them. I think things are much more complicated than that, and that for me, what I don't understand with your analysis is when you say that it's different from fascism, you don't give me the aims to understand, You don't give me the possibility to understand in what way is it different. Just saying it's different doesn't enable me to understand why is it different. I think that some point, for me, the most important point to understand that phenomena is the religious aspect, which you can't be at all understood with the only sociological analysis, which is based on who are the people who are interested in Islamic fundamentalism, why are they interested, that is the problem. But by just having an analysis, a sociological analysis, I don't think you can understand the phenomena, the relation to the sacred, that is the problem in a profane society like capitalist society. And I don't think that a socialist answer, even though I am socialist, on just an economical basis, can even answer to that. So just saying, "Oh, come with us, the real enemy is capitalism," which I agree. Just saying that, "Come with us, we are socialists and we'll fight to make another world," that I don't think that can be an answer, because you miss the point. You miss the point, which is the religious aspect, and that for me is even in the danger and the problem of the fundamentalism, the Islamic fundamentalism.
Okay, the next speaker will be followed by the man just there.
Yes, I think that to call Islamic fundamentalism fascism is absolutely wrong. I mean, the point that the speaker before made, that the regime in Iran is oppressive, is absolutely correct. But so was the regime before. I mean, the Shah regime was at least as oppressive as the Mullah regime there. And the question that arises is, what's the difference? I mean, what is fascism all about? If you just put fashion as another term for oppression, then almost every or quite a lot of regimes on earth are fascist, so it doesn't mean anything anymore. And what this analysis leads to, we can see in Algeria. When in Algeria in 1992 a military coup took place, lots of the Western intelligentsia, the liberals and so on and so forth, were quite nice to the military rulers, and they don't call them fascists because they thought at least they are against the Islamic fundamentalists. And after this, a bloody civil war developed, and almost 100,000 people were killed. And everybody said, "Oh, it's the Islamic fundamentalists, Islamic fundamentalists." What happens is that just a book was written by a man called Habib Souaidia, who was an officer in the Algerian army, and he revealed that quite a lot of the massacres that took place and the most barbaric acts were committed by the armed forces themselves. And today, what happens is, as the speaker said, is that a part of the fundamentalists are now part of the coalition, of the governing coalition, together with the FLN, the former Liberation Front, and are together fighting with the army against the new uprisings that took place over the last months. And I want to finish with this point. I mean, things are a bit too pessimistic here. We argued over the years that Islamic fundamentalism is a reaction to the failure of the left. That's true. But in between, something has happened. The Islamists in Palestine, for example, they still are part of a popular uprising, so it seems to me that they get stronger. But in Algeria, they're finished. They are a band of terrorists that here and there have public support, where they seem to be still a force against the government. But the majority of the Islamists, they are part of the oppression of the governing forces, and they have been mobilized in Algiers against this million demonstration months ago. So what happens is that we can say a new uprising takes place in this country. This opens up a space for a genuine left alternative that will give an answer. And I think part of those who supported the Islamists yesterday will support new left forces if we take the chance.
Okay, the next speaker will be followed by the comrade over there.
Since the 50s, imperialism, in particular U.S. imperialism, has used Islam as a force of reaction and against communism, and in particular directed against the Soviet Union. and the recent rise of Islam is also in particular related to the dead end of nationalism in the Middle East, and also despair. So there is something referred to, if some people remember, opium of the masses. In this discussion, and I think the presentation, the class nature of forces in society has somewhat disappeared. What is required is the independent mobilization of the proletariat. So as the speaker pretty much laid out, this has led, I believe, to the SWP lining up behind the forces of reaction in Iran, which crushed the working organizations. We know what happened to the women. To put it mildly, they were anti-women. They killed the national minorities. They crushed the left. In Indonesia, these forces were behind the anti-Chinese pogroms. In Algeria, they have been responsible for murder of thousands of women and leftists and trade unionists and journalists. In Afghanistan, and it was laid out very clearly, the CIA-backed fundamentalists were politically supported by the SWP in terms of that position. As they are as reactionary as anti-woman you can get. And in the question of Afghanistan in particular, it intersected with the question of the, in a sense, anti-communism of the SWP, because in particular it drew a class line against the Soviet Union, which was not a capitalist government. So there is a quote which I think pretty much is clear along the lines of what the speaker said from a SWP article. Just as socialists welcome the defeat of the U.S. in Vietnam, we welcome the defeat of Russians in Afghanistan. It will give heart to all those inside the USSR and Eastern Europe who want to break the rule of Stalin's heirs. Well, that program came into being today in Afghanistan and in the Russia, which we can see what the final outcome of it was. Then it's interesting, on the cheering Islam, then on the other hand, again ruling to the imperialists, the SWP looking to imperialists and the UN and so on. Then on the other hand, you call for, we say, we are appalled by the lack of action by Western governments to stop the slaughter in Palestine. So what's needed is by the imperialist forces, which have been behind the mess in the Middle East and Israel and the Palestinian question, to go in to bring democracy and justice for the Palestinian question. What is required in the Middle East, again, is the independent mobilization of the working class, which requires building a party to fight for power. In the International Communist League, we call for unconditional military defense of the Soviet Union against imperialism, which is posed today in China.
Okay. The next speaker will be for the speaker at the back in the white T-shirts.
Thinking about there's some Christian Muslim.
Can you speak up, please, comrade?
Christian Muslim violence in Indonesia. That I was just thinking that what's sort of lost in the coverage, I mean, mass media coverage of it, is the state policy on it's that you got to have like a certain identity, religious identity, to be a citizen. Like you've got to be one of 5 things. That's the policy. I think what's missed is state policy co-opting other things, and in a sense you use capitalism and the state almost interchangeably. I'm just sort of thinking about that. I'm not too articulate about it.
Okay, the next speaker will be followed by the comrade in center.
Just want to talk about many things in Islamic is not push people to support people to make or killing people or killing women or cut a hand for people. That is just, we want to call that group is a mafia group, is not Islamic group. Because they have many Islamic people in the war. He hit what Iran he did with people from Iran. He hit what Saudi Arabia he did with people from Saudi. He hit what Afghanistan and Taliban he did with his people. That people he have got a victim from the system, like Catholic and Protestant in North Ireland. They have no choice from that people to change him situation by him hand. Okay, we talk about Taliban. Taliban, he got money from Saudi. What thinking about? So where is he got gun? Where is he got bomb? Where is he got all that big gun from? He coming from all Russia or America or England. So why that people, he give him that gun to fight each other and fight with America also. So that means England, he give the gun for Taliban and or Afghanistan or any kind of country. And Saudi, he support Afghanistan people. So that he means same thing. Give people gun and money to kill each other. But and also he call them is Islamic crew. I'm not Muslims and I'm not religious. But also they have many things like Islamic, who's thinking about like Christian now, what happened in Christian religion. They have many Jews also. He had what Israel he doing with Arab people and Palestine. But also Jewish people from England. I have many friends, he's Jewish. He heard what Israel he doing in Palestine. Hezbollah from Lebanon. Lebanese people, he have no choice to change that party because they can't find other party to fight with Israel. That's all what he has. Thank you very much.
Okay. The next speaker will be followed by the comrade in the glasses at the back, who will be the last speaker.
Of course, Islamist movement is sometimes very dangerous. If they get the power or smash the state, they use a state as well to run the society. For whom? For a minority again. So every minority dictatorship is a dictatorship for a minority, for a majority. So in Iran, the oppression not just come from the Islamists. There is an oppression, but because there is a dictatorship of a minority. Every minority dictatorship has to use oppression. There is no way. So the level of oppression might fall or rise. Depends on the class struggle. Not depends on the ideology of the ruling class. So. What actually I'm going to say is, what is the main difference between fascist and Islamist? For me, it's very clear. They based on the same class structure, the petty bourgeoisie class. When the economic crisis deepened, this class is getting angry and more angry. They use the both. Political movement use this anger. Fascists use to oppress minority, oppressed minority. For Kurdish, for example, in Turkey, against Kurdish or against Alevis. But what Islamists use, how Islamists use this anger? They use against the top, against the ruling class, against the state. That is the main difference. It is very important. One of them use this anger to smash the minorities, to smash the oppressed people, they want...
Can you start winding up, please,
okay. They want more powerful state, and Islamists want to smash the state. That is the very big difference.
Okay, Leon Trotsky said that what is at the root of opportunism, at the root of reformism, is a lack of faith that the working class can actually ever make a revolution. And that instead they will look to other forces. And here, clearly in this speech, the SWP is looking to other forces. It's looking to Islamic fundamentalism as another force which could actually be an anti-imperialist front. The reality of Islamic fundamentalism is it is against social progress. It means a living death for those women in Afghanistan, in Iran, and in other countries, in South Africa, in Indonesia, etc. And if you look at the history of the SWP on this question, which calls itself socialist, it has lined up with Islamic reaction, hailing the 1979 counter-revolution in Iran as a revolution. This was headlines about the spirit of a revolution in Iran. You know, women in Iran, right after Khomeini came into power, could not walk down the street unless they were fully veiled, or they would have acid thrown in their faces. They went after and smashed the workers' organizations in Iran, and the SWP stood on the side at that time of Khomeini. We said, the International Communist League said, down with the Shah, down with the mullahs. And we looked to the key oil workers in that region to actually fight against both dictatorships. And similarly on Afghanistan, it came through there again. The SWP supported the Mujahideen. Paul Foote, prominent SWP leader, even attacked the Thatcher government, saying that it actually could be true that British beef is getting into the mouths of Soviet Russian soldiers, and went after them for this, attacking them from the right and stuff. The International Communist League said, hail the Red Army, and extend the social gains of the Russian Revolution to the Afghani people. The SWP's position has brought about the Taliban and counter-revolution, which has led to increased ethnic warfare and massive attacks on the working class internationally. Take a side, comrades, and the SWP leadership took those.
Okay, before I bring Talat to sum up, I just want to have a couple of announcements. The first announcement is that there will be a team meeting at 1 o'clock in the Jeffrey Hall, so all team members go to the Jeffrey Hall at 1 o'clock. The second announcement is that there will be a meeting for all... Comrades, please calm down. Comrades, please settle down. The meeting's not finished yet. The second announcement will be that there is going to be a meeting for all SWP GRAP conveners, socialist work organisers, district and national committee members, which will be in the 1 o'clock at the upper hall. Okay, tell it.
Right. If I'm going to be accused of believing that social liberation does not come at the end of a gun or tanks, whether they're US tanks or Soviet tanks, then I'm guilty, because I'm sorry, no way on earth can you argue that the Soviet Union as a Stalinist regime was ever part of a liberating force anywhere in the world. I mean, you know, for the whole of its existence, for 40 years, people throughout its so-called satellites opposed it, fought against it, etc., etc. We have never stood in that Stalinist tradition, and we are proud never to have stood in that Stalinist tradition. Okay, to talk just about Iran, I mean, to argue that somehow the Iranian revolution was nothing more than a fascist revolution, that some kind of coup d'etat or whatever, is again, I think, fatally mistaken. Right, people have to remember the events of 1978-79. Before 1978, the regime that existed inside the Iranian state was one of the most loyal regimes for the United States. It was this loyal ally. The United States had provided the training for the forces of the Savak state, the Savak police, under the Shah. They had backed that regime up to the hilt. That regime had been involved in mass murder, in torture of its victims, whether they were people from national minorities, whether it was trade unionists, whether it was anybody that opposed them. When that revolution began to take shape in 1978-79, it was not led by the Islamists. It was not led by Ayatollah Khomeini. Ayatollah Khomeini came onto the scene much later, when the revolution was over, and in terms of how he was going to consolidate it. The people that made that revolution possible were motivated by one factor and one factor only, and that was their sheer hatred of the Shah regime, their sheer hatred of its corruption, of the luxury items that they had, and the impoverishment of the mass of the people, and they absolutely hated it because of its links with American imperialism. That was the reason why workers up and down the oil refineries, the oil terminals, workers in the factories formed councils that were called the Shuras, because they were against the regime. When I hear people say that women were forced to take the veil during the revolution, again, talk about being economical with the truth. When the revolution happened, for many of the women that were involved in that revolutionary upheaval, they chose to wear the veil. Now, whether you think that's right or wrong is irrelevant. It was not enforced upon them. There were women that took that as a sign of their liberation, because as far as they were concerned, if they went around in miniskirts, in lipstick, and in high heels, they regarded that as a sign of their oppression imposed by Western imperialism. You have to look at the context. You have to be concrete about it. In the 1990s, we have a situation in France where young Muslim girls, North African girls, cannot wear headscarves to school. It's okay for Christian kids to wear the cross
to wear the crucifix, but it's not okay for Muslim girls to wear the headscarf into school because the French state says that that is an example of Islamic fundamentalism. Now, you know, and in that situation, you have young Moroccan girls, young Algerian girls who identify themselves as being Muslim. We have to be concrete. You can't just sit on the sidelines and say, oh, this is Islamic, it's fascist, it's wrong. I want to talk also about what fascism is. I mean, people have already referred to it. But fascism as a movement is a movement of the middle classes. It is a movement of the petty bourgeoisie. It is a movement whose sole purpose is to attack and smash workers' organizations. Its sole purpose is to attack the left. That is the history of fascism. That's what the Nazis did in the 1930s in Germany. That's what the Italians, fascists, did in Italy in the 1920s and in the 1930s. That's what Francoism was about in the 1930s in Spain. That's what the Nazi BNP are about in Britain today. To somehow equate all Islamists with fascists is again, I think, fundamentally flawed. Because what's the logic of it? So if you're saying that all Islamics are fascists, if you're saying that anyone that looks to those ideas are fascists, what does that mean? Does that mean that we have to have coachloads of anti-Nazi supporters going up to Oldham and smashing our way through the Asian ghettos where Asians live because they define themselves as Nazis, because that's what you would do if they were Nazis? Then, it's just completely ludicrous. The people who are attracted to these forces do not see themselves as Nazis. They don't even see themselves as completely fundamentalists either. They are drawn to those forces because they want to fight back against a system. And I think this is fundamentally important, okay? And I think this is also important because there are many movements in the world which can have a similar social base to fascist organization. It does not mean to say that they are fascist. Peronism in Argentina had a similar middle-class base to fascist organizations, to various Islamist organizations across the world. It does not mean to say that it was fascist. I want to come to an end. The thing about religion, when people say that, oh, this is not Islam, this is Islam, etc., etc., I mean, we could sit here debating all day until the cows come home what Islam is and what Islam isn't, okay? The question is not what an individual says a religion is, but what are the social forces behind that particular religious movement. When you think about Christianity, there has always been Christian fundamentalism, and there was a movement throughout the 1970s and 80s that was called liberation theology. Completely different. They were not the same. Christian fundamentalism in the United States is anti-abortion, it supported slavery, supports segregation. Liberation theology in Latin America was about opposing the state, opposing the juntas, wanting to fight for the poor, wanting to fight for the oppressed. And the same things happens inside Islamist organizations. You cannot just see them as all being one monolithic movement. We have to be concrete about it. And the final thing I will just say is that our attitude towards, I mean, when someone started off at the beginning to talk about the role of the left and the role of Stalinism in most of these countries and the tragedy that has come about as a result of it, the responsibility of genuine socialists is absolutely enormous. Because whilst we can understand why people may be drawn to Islamist ideas because they hate the system, because they want to fight back against the system, and yes, we can unite with them on immediate activities in terms of whether it's fighting the fascists, fighting imperialism, etc. But the responsibility that we have to challenge their ideas, to challenge their backwardness on women, to challenge their ideas, whether it's on Jews, on gays, or whatever, is absolutely enormous. We have to challenge them. We have to fight to win those over that we can win over. Because the only way to fight for a real change in society is to fight by understanding what the real enemy is. And the real enemy is imperialism, the real enemy is capitalism. And we can only do that successfully when people understand that. And so therefore the responsibility of the left is absolutely enormous. But we can only get that right if we understand where these organizations come from in the first place. We can only do that right if we understand that they are not one monolithic movement, that we have to look concretely at the circumstances in which they arise, where they come from, and what their base is, and what they're arguing. Only by doing that can we then hope to engage, to challenge, to argue, and to win people that genuinely want to fight for a new kind of society over to a new vision that really can challenge society and change it for the better.